So good afternoon, and thank you very much for having me speak. When I was CEO of Green Building Council of Australia, we worked incredibly closely with NGAA for years and years, so it was a thrill to be asked to present today, so thank you very much. My colleague Peter Colaccino spoke at your conference last year, and it was following the launch of Planning Livable Cities report, and he spoke then of the two-speed growth occurring in our cities and the need for reform in the way we are planning and delivering infrastructure to meet the demands of high-growth areas. So today I'd really like to share some of the findings of our infrastructure audit and the challenges and opportunities. But firstly, before I start, I really would like to acknowledge the Noongar people, the traditional owners of the land and waterways on which we're gathered, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and any Indigenous leaders in the room today. I'd also like to just bring up two things. I've never been to the Swan Valley, so driving through today from the airport, and I did get slightly lost because I was sent to where you were last night. So I really have seen the Swan Valley. Crossing the rivers and driving through the wineries and over a squash snake, it really brought home to me, some of you will remember that I lived at Lake George with my family for 14 years and we ran a vineyard and had cattle. And so it was bringing back some enormous memories for me. It also brought back memories of the times that we had bushfires when we were at Lake George. And then we moved to Sydney, to the Northern Beaches, and I thought, we won't have to deal with bushfires. And we were both members of voluntary bushfire collector, and we became lifesavers. And on the flight here, I got called up as a lifesaver for the bushfires in Sydney. And I was telling the pilot on the plane, and he said, what can lifesavers do? And I said, on the 21 beaches of the Northern Beaches, we probably have 100 assets that we can use, being IRBs, the rubber boats, jet skis, and the fire that I was called up to this morning, but I obviously couldn't help, was we could access and take firefighters across in the rubber boats to West Head. So I never thought that I would be called up to a bushfire. So please have a thought for all those bushfires that are happening in Western Australia, Queensland and New South Wales, especially tomorrow in New South Wales. So I just want to, some of you might not be aware of what Infrastructure Australia does. The first question I had at Senate estimates this year, I was telling Ben before, was Ms Madew, is Infrastructure Australia like Utopia? And I said, I'll choose not to answer that, but I thoroughly enjoy watching Utopia. A little bit. We were created in 2008, and what's really important to understand is there is nothing like the infrastructure body, so we're known as I-bodies. We were the first in Australia, so Infrastructure Australia was the first of its kind globally. We now have an I-body in every state, including WA, and there's now one that was created a month ago in New Zealand, one in UK. Singapore has an equivalent authority. But you've got to remember, we are unique. So sometimes we make mistakes, but when we do things like release the audit that we released in 2015 and the audit we released this year, is we're learning as we're going because there's no one we can follow in what we do. But I think the audit we did this year was fantastic. But the two core functions we did, just to remind you, so don't come and ask me for money, is we evaluate the business cases. Yes, the BCR was mentioned before, but we evaluate them. We don't have the money. So any project over $100 million that is seeking federal government funding have to do a business case through Infrastructure Australia. The second thing we do is we set the agenda on long-term opportunities for infrastructure reform that will improve quality of life and economic productivity. So coming back to the audit, it was great for me to start in May, or I started in late April, and to come straight into the final weeks of the audit because it's a fantastic document. I'm assuming you haven't read the 642 pages, but if you download the 85-page executive summary, it really is a very rich and awesome document, and I'll explain why. We've taken a forward-looking view of the challenges and opportunities affecting Australia's infrastructure, and we do this, as I've mentioned, through the 5-yearly infrastructure audits. But the important thing about this audit is it did a number of things differently than the last audit. Firstly, it looked at all sectors, so transport, looking at passenger and freight, water, energy, waste, telecommunications, and all forms of social infrastructure. And the last audit we did, we didn't look at social infrastructure. So in the previous panel, they were talking about green infrastructure. We look at green and blue, healthcare. Oh, he's also talking about education as well. Look at education, arts, culture, housing. So we really take a broad view. The second thing we did is we did it geographically, not jurisdictionally. So when we had the 2015 audit, we looked at it via the jurisdictions. But then we realised Australia is incredibly unique and diverse. And we're not made up of jurisdictions because the state lines blur the actual geographies that really represent Australia. So we took a different approach and looked at fast-growing cities, being Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne and Perth, smaller cities and regional towns, small remote area, regional and rural Australia, and then northern Australia and developing areas in Australia. So the geographic was really important. The next thing we did is we saw it as an evidence base to guide future investment and reform, and we took a community-centred approach, looking at access, quality and cost. And if you think about all your infrastructure in your area, in your geography, you can think about quality, access and cost in every piece of infrastructure you think about. Think about a park. It's free, so that's cost. Is it accessible for all? But what's the quality like? Recently there was an issue in Tiwi Islands where its mobile phone coverage was out for 3 days. That's across to access, quality and cost. And that had an amazing impact on them because they couldn't do shopping online, they couldn't do school, they couldn't walk into the shops and use their cards. So we really took this really important lens of a community-centred approach. And as I said, we put the outcomes for the users at the centre of the research and advice rather than sectors. The challenges and opportunities identified will inform the solutions and recommendations that will feed into the 2021 Australian Infrastructure Plan, and we've already received over 100 submissions to the audit. The headline message that emerged from the audit is that Australia's infrastructure program must do more than plug the immediate funding gap. Infrastructure in our 4 largest cities, Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne and Perth, is failing to keep pace with growth, particularly on the urban fringe. If we don't see further investment beyond what is currently under construction, under procurement, or has construction funding committed to it, congestion in Sydney and Melbourne will double over this period, while congestion in Brisbane and Perth could triple. Modelling commissioned for this year's audit has found that the road congestion and public transport crowding cost the Australian economy $19 billion in 2016. Without continued investment in our city, so if no more investment happened today, that will double to $40 billion by 2031. The good news is we are well positioned to continue these record levels of investment. Australian governments have made progress on promoting reform since the publication of the last audit in 2015. More than $123 billion of construction work has commenced since 2015, with a committed forward pipeline of $200 billion. In recent months, federal government, the opposition, state governments and the Reserve Bank of Australia made commitments to nation-building infrastructure and called for more investment in small and mid-sized transport projects. It is critical that we maintain community support for this investment, for reform and to maintain industry's commitment to expanding skills and capacity in the face of expanding needs. As you all know, growth and urbanisation are happening at a different rate between and within our major cities, and that was mentioned before. The result is a divide for outcome for users, with some users disadvantaged in their access to infrastructure networks and services, and the quality and cost of these services. Supporting our growth areas then becomes an issue of equity. Equity and access to the world-class standard of living our nation is known for. This divide in outcomes doesn't fall neatly along conventional state and territory boundaries, and that's why I mentioned that we framed it differently this year by the type of community or area they serve. This recognises that while all Australians share a common need for infrastructure that is high quality, affordable and accessible, infrastructure must also respond to local needs. And it's why we framed it through the different geographies as I mentioned. The way Australians experience and access infrastructure reflects the nation's diverse geographies and communities, and a nuanced debate about our future infrastructure needs requires us to speak at a level of community in place. It may be that the clearest example of the inequity in service provision is in our remote communities. The audit found that 30% of households in remote areas are overcrowded, and remote communities do not meet the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal 6, clean water and sanitation for all. However, inequity is visible in our urban fringe as well, where a lack of access to services like public transport can exacerbate inequality along income lines, which was mentioned before. In 2018, our Outer Urban Public Transport report identified that 1 million people in both Sydney and Brisbane's outer suburbs and 1.4 million people in Melbourne are not within walking distance of reasonable quality public transport. With public transport systems that are designed to merge routes at a city centre, outer suburbs are disadvantaged by lower service frequencies, meaning less regular services for people trying to get to work, school, home or cultural activities. On top of this, the concentration of job opportunities toward the city centre, particularly high-paying jobs, means that people living in the outer suburbs have longer travel times to get to work. Around 45% of people living in outer suburbs travelled more than 20 kilometres to get to work. This compared to 7% in inner suburbs. This divide can contribute to worsening inequality along income lines. Employment in traditionally lower paying jobs such as retail, hospitality and other human services are more evenly distributed around where people live compared to higher paying employment such as financial and professional services, which are concentrated in pockets. This means that when infrastructure services are poorly planned outside of these pockets, those who are most disadvantaged in terms of income are also those most disadvantaged by struggling infrastructure services. For example, their access to public transport. On top of this, this divide can also have a gendered impact. The participation of women in the workforce in our cities is increasing, but it is weighted towards same lower paying services industries I've just outlined, those more distributed away from the centre. This growing inequality is magnified as housing and unaffordability increases. For more and more people, the only place they can afford to live is in the outer suburbs. Here, housing costs may still be relatively high compared to what their parents paid, but wages are lower and transport distances and costs are often higher. Supporting our growing outer suburbs isn't just about growing public transport networks in this area. It's about working with communities to build the services they need to support their quality of life where they live. So how do we bridge this divide? A critical starting point is ensuring that we have a shared understanding of where growth is coming, and that again has been discussed today, at the local level. So we aren't delivering infrastructure services years after residents have moved in. Discrepancies between the different population projections being used by various levels of government and failure to account for factors that drive the movement and growth of populations can lead to uncertainty and make coordination planning incredibly difficult. In terms of local level population projections, where people live within Australia is influenced by factors such as economic growth, job availability, affordability, and lifestyle preferences. These factors can shift over time, meaning people can move to or away from places before projections can catch up. For example, the 2013 ABS population projections, based on the 2011 overestimated Perth's 2016 population by over 7%, as they were developed when the mining construction boom was peaking and assumed continued growth levels. Forecasts that account for births, deaths, immigration and other demographic factors such as ageing, skills, jobs and infrastructure provision, and testing these forecasts against a number of different scenarios will be critical if we are to get on the front foot for coming growth. Infrastructure Australia welcomes the recent establishment of a Centre for Population in Treasury, and we hope it will assist the Australian Government to develop forecasts for population growth at a national level that are translated to account for spatial impacts at a local level. The next step is to bridge the gap between our planning and our practice, between our best laid plans and investments and their impact on the ground. For our 2018 Planning Livable Cities, we conducted a detailed assessment how the planning processes in our major cities were translating to communities on the ground. First, we did a review of the planning systems, overarching governance frameworks and funding arrangements these cities have in place to deliver infrastructure and housing to meet growth. Then we interviewed stakeholders from state government, local government and industry to get their views on how these planning processes translated into practice and outcomes for communities. We found Australia's major cities face common challenges when sequencing infrastructure and growth. In our larger cities, existing processes in many ways hinder a coordinated and place-based approach to strategic planning and delivery, and as a result, housing development is leading infrastructure delivery. Australia's governments are structured to deliver sectorial outcomes, such as transport, education and health services, and we've just heard of that example in Jindabyne, rather than place-based outcomes for specific communities. This can lead to siloed planning, inconsistent outcomes and unintended consequences for place and communities. State and local governments need to work together to develop local strategic plans that translate metropolitan strategies into tangible outcomes at a place level. In turn, local planning controls and development assessment processes need to be amended to reflect these strategic plans. This place-based approach can avoid unintended consequences for residents in growth areas. For example, avoid a new greenfield development being left without street trees because they haven't been coordinated with the delivery of utility services, or a new rail line extension furthering growth in an outer suburb but not being coupled with increased enrolment capacity in local schools. But it's important to note and recognise that by global standards, Australia's infrastructure governance is relatively strong. The 2019 audit found that our institutions and regulatory systems are well established and have performed reasonably well by ensuring affordable and efficient services for users. Since the last audit, there have been significant steps across Australia's government and state and territory governments to improve project planning and selection. The proportion of projects for which business cases have been undertaken has increased, and the rigour of most of these business cases has improved over recent years. Further to this, most state and territory governments and a number of local governments have published long-term infrastructure plans and created infrastructure agencies, and Lance is here, I think Lance is here today, from Acting CEO of Infrastructure WA. And it's really important. The I bodies guide governments on transparency in planning and governance and improve the rigour of infrastructure planning and delivery. And we all meet regularly every 2 to 3 months, and we all have a program of work together, and we're working incredibly closely together across all the infrastructure bodies. However, there is still substantial room for improvement. Projects have been announced without a detailed assessment of needs and possible solutions, and where they are undertaken, business cases are not always published to allow for public consultation and scrutiny. This issue in placing local community outcomes at the centre of our infrastructure planning process is a key area in which we need to do better as a matter of urgency. Communities are increasingly disappointed by their experience of growth and in turn increasingly resistant to change. Community trust in governments to deliver infrastructure and services to growing areas is declining, and communities feel left out of the conversation about their future. 4 out of 5 Australians believe it is extremely or very important to consider the views of community when planning and investing in major infrastructure. The audit found that current engagement with stakeholders and the broader community on project and operation decisions is lacking across most sectors and jurisdictions. The weight of community engagement needs to come early on at the strategic level to enable the community to contribute an understanding of the local character of place and beyond individual projects. We need frank conversations about expectations and trade-offs with a commitment to tangible outcomes, transparent reporting and accountability. Through improving the standard of dialogue between community, governments and industry, we can move towards a shared vision of the investments we need most and the impact they will have at place and community level. Infrastructure Australia develops the infrastructure priority list, the pipeline, and we release that at the beginning of each year, but it's a live list. And it transparently outlines a consensus list of the nation's priority infrastructure problems and opportunities. The priority list provides a robust set of nationally significant infrastructure investments required by the nation over the next 15 years. And it includes critical public transport investment in growth areas, from Metronet's Yanchep rail extension to supporting the growing city of Wanneroo here in Western Australia, to the Melton rail line upgrades in Victoria to support the Melton to Bacchus March growth areas. The priority list also includes initiatives that will grow opportunities closer to where people live, like the Western Sydney Airport initiatives in New South Wales, which presents opportunities to generate economic activity and provide employment opportunities closer to home for people in Western Sydney. These are projects and initiatives that have been through Infrastructure Australia's robust assessment process so that governments, industry and the community can be confident that they will benefit quality of life for Australians. So in conclusion, the task ahead is significant but not impossible. The infrastructure sector is already experiencing capacity constraints, and it's clear that government and industry will need to adjust to meet the challenges ahead. Amid a period of constant and rapid change, growing social, economic and environmental interdependencies have added complexity to planning, delivery and operating our infrastructure. The audit is designed to help us all become more attuned to these challenges and the opportunities to raise the bar on infrastructure accessibility, quality and cost, regardless of where you live. The audit is only the first step in our policy process to identify nationally significant investment and reform priorities. And as I've said, we've sought submissions, which closed last month, in response to the audit, and we're now working on the plan. The work that we'll do with the plan will inform the development of our priority list and plan, shaping the vision of infrastructure planning and delivery for the next 15 years. I thank you for those who've made contributions to this dialogue. Encourage you all to contribute your knowledge and collaboration for us all in our infrastructure planning. Thank you very much and enjoy lunch. Yeah, sure.
Thanks. Kelly Grigsby, the CEO of Wyndham City Council. Thanks so much for your presentation. One of the key challenges, of course, in growth cities, particularly communities like ours, is the need for schools and kindergartens, particularly schools. And we know there's been a deficit in terms of pipeline planning for these. I'm just interested in Infrastructure Australia's approach to, assisting with this challenge and what you as an organisation have in mind in terms of helping expedite some of that planning at a state and national level.
So it's really important to remember the audit is that it's an audit. So it identifies 180 challenges and opportunities, and it identifies exactly what you've said. Under social infrastructure, there are a number of, and so there's, as I said, it's just not challenges, we also identify the opportunities. But we talk about the issue around both education and healthcare as well. So it's not just access to schools, it's also access to hospitals and other healthcare services. So the audit just does that. It calls out the problem that you have correctly identified. And it's saying we're not doing the planning, we're not aligning our population growth projections with planning and going, okay, we can see that area's population growth is quite high. We need to be thinking about the schools now, and we've got examples all over Australia of that. So the audit is just that. It calls out the problem. We then ask for solutions and suggestions to that, and that's what we'll pick up in the plan, which is the next document. But really it comes down to the thing we constantly say the whole way through, and I heard it in the last panel, is collaboration and communication, and you have to take a place-based approach, not a sectorial approach. And we have examples all over Australia where we've gone, oh, well, like the Jindabyne one, oh, we'll do that, but is that the right thing? So I'll give you an example, and when I was listening to him talk about Jindabyne, I was like, oh. So Launceston, this is about a university, not a school, but you'll hear where I'm coming from. Launceston's, the University of Tasmanian's Launceston campus, the number of enrolments were falling, the CBD was having problems, people, they were losing, their population numbers were falling, so on and so forth. So thinking about Jindabyne and your master plan, they said, and the university was not fit for purpose. Like it was just, it It was out on the edge of Launceston. Public transport wasn't really good. Accessibility, access, quality and cost. Remember those three, access, quality and cost? You'd be amazed where you can bring those three up. I did it the other day in another meeting. It was hysterical. And so what they did is, what are they doing? They're moving and building a whole new campus in the CBD. Because the money to spend, I know you're shaking your head going exactly what the guy from Jindabyne up the top, the money they would spend in upgrading the university, they were never going to achieve what they needed to, and that was they can help with retail, accommodation, the livability of Launceston, fit for purpose and the latest classes, because it's all about open space now, not the old lecture halls that we all went to. And so under the city deal, they've done a business case to Infrastructure Australia. We positively approved it. And now I know that Darwin are looking at doing the same thing. So what that was is the university working closely with the local government and with the state government for that outcome. I was coming to where I was trying to give you the answer. And they all worked really collaboratively together, and you have used the term collaboration, and it's bringing everyone on a journey with you, and that's a great example of where you've got the tiers of government, 3 tiers of government, and the university coming forward with a great outcome.
I'll throw one in, if that's okay. I love the new definitions, or the new sort of looking at place-based approach. So fast-growing cities, for example. My sort of small concern, I suppose, is the difference between an outer suburb of a fast-growing city and an inner suburb. And while we focus policy and investment on fast-growing cities, I think we risk going back to those old days where it is about the city, not the suburbs. And so I just wanted to get some guarantee, I suppose, I know that's not the intention, but how can we make sure that doesn't happen? And then how do we also address that connection between our growth areas and regional cities? Because, there's two-way traffic there. There's two-way use of that infrastructure.
Did any of you go to the Greater Sydney Commission launch last week, their infrastructure launch? Yeah, okay. Is that you, Ben? Of course you did. You might be better to answer this than I am, because I didn't go, but I'll give a... Ben and I used to be on a committee together for Northern Beaches Council. So what Greater Sydney Commission is trying to do is it launched a place-based approach last week, and it really is about G-pop, and that's not a Korean folk song. That's Greater Sydney and Olympic... Is it Greater Sydney? Greater Parramatta and Olympic Park. I just worry about the Olympic Park because I'm on that board. But it was all about that growth area, taking it all into account, and what the infrastructure of that growth area needed to be. Ben, am I missing anything else? What else was in there? Yep.
Thanks. It was, what was a place-based infrastructure compact, I think was how it was described. And so it looked at a couple of different scenarios for the growth, and then sought to phase the infrastructure planning with the growth at the same time. So obviously it's something that growth councils have a lot, where the houses come first and the infrastructure later, if at all. And so what it was trying to do was actually phase it and bring all the stakeholders to the table up front to agree the overall plan and how it would be delivered.
And the reason why that work is, thanks Ben, and the reason why that work's so important is, coming back to your question, is they really are going out to all the stakeholders. And so they're briefing us, we're all at other events so we couldn't go, but they're briefing all the different stakeholders to answer what you've identified as an issue, to make sure that it's front of mind for us, that we're thinking about that. We're not just taking a CBD approach, we're taking an outer area and growth areas approach. So it's, for those of you who've coming from different states, I think you can learn from some of the work that Greater Sydney Commission have done, and Sarah's very available to sharing the learnings for that. The older people in the room will remember the COAG work the COAG Reform Council work that was done on capital city strategic planning, and do any of you remember that? Yeah, there we go. So there's a few of us around that remember that. So Greater Sydney Commission came out of that, and it talked about the importance of coordination and collaboration between the 3 tiers of government. And so I think really looking at the work that the Greater Sydney Commission's doing has been really good.